This person asked, does non-fermented dairy contain oxalates? They're still reacting to butter and milk. Now, I say this with the caveat that for me, when I first started out, I wanted to incorporate dairy back in, but I struggled mightily, even with fermented dairy, which I think was probably a histamine response to the fermentation. Through trial and error and slowly, low and slow, I've managed to add dairy back in and I have no consequence. I think that is also part and parcel because I healed my gut, stopped bombing it with the high oxalate foods.
Yep.
And it is, as we know and have talked about in past episodes, very important in terms of the calcium to bind the oxalate as your body starts to excrete and through the dumping process. But having discussed this with you just offline, there are a couple of really interesting things that is going to come out of this discussion. So please let the listeners know about this one.
So I will start out by saying when it comes to oxalate and getting it out of your system, mineral levels are job one. Because as a mineral chelator, and I would say an indiscriminate mineral chelator, oxalate is going to impact them in a significant way. And so that is one of the reasons that if people can keep dairy in their diet, I recommend it because it's a high mineral food, whole food, and generally is low in oxalate. But there's a gotcha here potentially. If you have non-fermented dairy, in most cases, whether we're talking about even things like cheeses or raw milk or whatever version of dairy, butter, it's going to be low oxalate unless the animals are foraging on high oxalate forage. Okay. So the thing about oxalate is that the research in the veterinarian world has discovered that if mum sheep, cow, goat is eating high oxalate forage, and that oxalate's being absorbed. So even with a multi-chambered stomach, blah, 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 they are not necessarily breaking down that oxalate sufficiently if they're eating really high oxalate forage. It's getting into their system. We do know from the veterinarian research world that oxalate can be taken up and get through the placenta. We also have some understanding of the fact that the higher oxalate the animal's taking in, the more likely it turns up in their milk. So what do we do then? Like, we've got this great farmer lives down the road from us. We're getting, pristine, organic, wild forage animals. But what if they're eating high oxalate? And without testing, it's really hard to know for sure. But one of the things from the research is that they've discovered that animals of, sheep, goats, cattle, if they're on high forage, will miscarry more readily. So if for some reason your farmer says, well, everything's going really well, but my animals don't carry their pregnancies well, if somebody's happened to say that, that would be an alert that they've got something in those fields that's high oxalate, and maybe those animals are getting too much of it. Is dairy generally low oxalate? Yes, it is. But can there be caveats? Yeah, there can be. So, yeah.